Those three things can very easily add over 100 wheel horsepower to your 6.2 liter EcoTec3. Hey guys, Jake from 80/20 Media here. Today we're going to be talking about performance modifications and upgrades for GM's 6.2 liter EcoTec3 V8. Fortunately, this is going to be a pretty short video because there really are only 3 modifications that make sense from a price to horsepower standpoint. And those 3 modifications are custom tuning with flex fuel or E85, headers and a Y pipe, and then the third thing is going to be camshaft upgrades. Now, there are of course a number of other modifications that can be done to these engines. However, tuning and flex fuel, headers, and camshafts are really where the big power gains are going to come from without going into more advanced things like forced induction, turbocharging, supercharging, so on and so forth. There are a number of other modifications that you can do that are a little bit smaller in nature, like a cold air intake or a catback exhaust system, but those don't offer quite as good power gains as the rest of these modifications, and so they just don't quite make as much sense from a price to performance standpoint. First off, there are 2 different versions of the 6.2 liter EcoTec3. We have the L86, which has AFM, and the L87, which has DFM. The engine's been out since 2014, so of course from 2014 to 2025, there are a number of various different changes that have been made to these engines, and so the amount of horsepower that your engine starts with is going to depend on what year and what model of the 6.2 liter you have. But all in all, these 3 modifications can pretty easily add over 100 wheel horsepower to the 6.2 liter. If you really want to push 500 plus wheel horsepower and do it consistently, you're going to want to start looking into things like forced induction or more advanced modifications like porting out the heads and so on and so forth. And those things get into a ton of different considerations, and so we're going to save the rest of those for a different video. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into all of these in a little bit more depth. To start things off, I mentioned we have cold air intakes and catback exhaust systems. These 2 modifications are really probably only going to add 5 to maybe 10 wheel horsepower, and they're ultimately going to cost you about $600 to $1,000 to do. And so you just get very modest power gains for the cost of them. So those relative to the 3 modifications that I recommend just don't add a ton of horsepower. So first off, jumping into the first thing, we have flex fuel or E85 and custom tuning. Some 6.2 liter motors came from the factory flex fuel capable. If you look at your gas cap, if you have a yellow gas cap or a yellow marking inside the gas door, then you have a flex fuel capable vehicle. And the good news with that is you can go and fill up on a tank of E85 without needing any modifications done to your vehicle, and E85 alone adds pretty solid horsepower gains. If we can combine that E85 with custom tuning, you can see upwards of 30 to 40 wheel horsepower, and ultimately the only cost here is going to be on the custom tuning because you don't have to do anything for the flex fuel. Now, if you don't have a flex fuel capable truck, you can do some upgrades to make it flex fuel capable, which are worthwhile, especially if you're looking into forced induction down the road, as there are a ton of performance and power benefits to running E85 fueling. But all in all, if you have a flex fuel truck, run E85 and get custom tuning for the E85, and you'll be able to get 30 to 40 plus wheel horsepower gains just off of that alone. The second modification is going to be the headers along with a Y pipe. When we talk about exhaust upgrades as a whole, the headers are going to be where the primary power gains come from. And then you have the Y pipe, which it's a little bit more controversial in terms of whether you want to keep your catalytic converters or delete them. But ultimately, the headers and the Y pipe are where big power gains are going to come from. And the exhaust system and headers on the 6.2 liter are relatively restrictive from the factory. So just by upgrading the headers and the Y pipe, you can also see about 30 wheel horsepower gains from those alone. And then of course you have the catback portion of the exhaust system. It might make sense to just go ahead and upgrade the whole exhaust whenever you're doing the headers and the Y pipe. But like I mentioned, the catback portion of the exhaust is relatively expensive compared to the amount of power gains you're getting out of it. And so if you're looking into exhaust upgrades, headers and a Y pipe are where I'd put your money. And then the third thing here is going to be camshaft upgrades. Camshaft upgrades do of course get a little bit more complicated because you have to actually crack into the engine to change them, but camshaft upgrades are what are going to be able to take you from getting 60, 70, or 80 wheel horsepower gains to be able to break into the 100 plus wheel horsepower gains without adding forced induction. Just a modest stage 1 or a modest stage 2 camshaft can easily add up to 50 wheel horsepower on these engines, and that makes camshafts probably the #1 modification from a power standpoint. And of course, to do a camshaft upgrade, you will need custom tuning with it as well. As you're doing that at the same time, it makes sense to completely delete the displacement on demand or AFM and DFM systems that are in these trucks. Now, if you aren't doing a camshaft upgrade or a DOD delete, we 100% recommend running our Boost AFM disabler to keep your truck in V8 mode 100% of the time and prevent any lifter failure. Alongside that, camshaft upgrades are also relatively complex. There's lots of different routes that you can go that affect drivability, and so you'll want to do a lot more research to the point that we're going to go ahead and save camshaft upgrades and the actual intricacies of that for a separate video as well. So guys, that really wraps it up on our 3 modifications. We've got flex fuel and custom tuning, we've got headers and a Y-pipe, and then we've got camshaft upgrades. And those 3 things can very easily add over 100 wheel horsepower to your 6.2 liter EcoTec3. But again, like I mentioned, if you really want to start pushing far beyond that 500 wheel horsepower mark, you're going to want to go ahead and look into forced induction. Anyways, guys, that covers it for this video. I hope you appreciate the content. If you did, click that like button, subscribe to our channel, and stay tuned for all the future guides and videos that we'll do covering the 6.2 liter EcoTec3.